Entropy, impedance, and current, all three are fictions. We have this silly notion of entropy in which something loses energy, as if energy could travel, as if current could move. And because of these fictions that we entertain, we also entertain the silly notion that impedance is part of the process of entropy, when in fact it has nothing to do with entropy. It's such a vague term. It has something more to do with destructive interference versus constructive interference. What type of interference is taking place? Impedance deals with both. And we've always interpreted impedance to be of the destructive variety, but we don't call it that. We call it entropy. We call it loss. But there's no such thing as loss. Nothing is being lost except the constructivity of interference. Interference interferes with non-change. And if it didn't, everything would stay the same all the time and nothing would change, and we would not know what energy means, because energy has to do with change. So you have to have interference in order to have energy, because energy is a phenomenon, it's a dynamic, it's an event, it's not a thing that you carry around. You can't take a cup of energy like you do a cup of sugar. It's not material. It's ephemeral. It's what we think is current, for instance. Pick up currents. What we think is current is actually a pattern and has nothing to do with the host that hosts that pattern that we call current, that ripple that goes down the transmission line. That's a pattern hosted by the material of construction of the wire, the transmission wire. So if current is a fiction because nothing really moves, then you can't lose anything, so there's no such thing as entropy. So there's simply interference with non-change. It's either destructive or constructive. So the destructive causes things to diminish, while the constructive causes things to increase. And the thing in question is this fiction we call energy. Because energy is, if current is a fiction, then energy is a fiction. Inasmuch as it's not a thing, it's a dynamic of things. It's a quality we give it more than what it actually possesses. And then there's this other thing that energy does not come from outside the circuit. It does not enter the circuit. It does not leave the circuit. It's always in there in the circuit. It's in the materials of construction. Any energy you could possibly want a circuit to exhibit is already in the copper, the rubber, all the materials of the construction of the circuit. It's already there. Now, if you force a situation through peer pressure of inducing a tremendous voltage difference between two terminals of your circuit from outside the circuit, let's say a battery pack in an electric car, sure, you're going to get a forced situation in which the materials of construction of your circuit are going to exhibit behavioral characteristics that make it look like, oh, energy entered the circuit from the battery pack. Did it really? You know, when you study the current of a battery pack, there are two currents. There's one coming out of the battery pack going through the circuit and then coming back to the opposite terminal of the battery pack to neutralize the voltage differences and cause the battery to become more dead. But there's also another current going in the opposite direction from the same terminal. So whichever terminal you want to pick, you know, the electron model of current or the conventional model, let's say it's the electron model. So you've got current coming out of the negative terminal of the battery pack, going out of the battery through the circuit and going back to the positive terminal of the battery pack to neutralize the voltage differences between the two terminals. But then you've also got another flow of current coming out of the negative terminal of the battery, but going through the battery, a shortcut to its positive terminal. and both currents flow at the same time in opposite directions. They go from the same terminal to the same target terminal to perform the same event of neutralization of voltage. Now, which one is performing the event? Was it the current traveling outside the battery or the current traveling inside the battery that neutralized the voltage potential of the battery, the voltage difference between the two terminals of the battery? Which was it? Both, because you can't have one without the other, because it's really not a movement of a thing. It's a movement of a pattern that can't help but go everywhere, because we have not sequestered it to stay in only one place or to be mostly in one place. And so we gave it free range to leave the battery and to go through the battery from the negative terminal to the positive terminal, but it's just a pattern. That's all it is. Now, we can say it's more than that because it changed the chemistry of the battery. Fine. But you can't say that about the copper wire. It didn't change any chemistry whatsoever. The only time we changed the chemistry of the copper wire was when we smelted copper ore and removed the slag. That slag had all the energy the copper ore possessed, and what's left is copper metal deficient in energy. That's why it's linking together into a solid metal sheet or a solid metal strand of extruded wire, because it's impoverished of energy. And in a state of poverty, its valence electrons lacking satisfaction of energy, satisfaction borrowed from the slag that was removed. Let's say it was sulfate, copper sulfate. The sulfate had all the energy, and now it's gone. And so the deficient copper links arms. It's like people creating a human chain, hooking their elbows around each other's elbows to create a human chain, like a daisy chain of people, arm to arm, linked together, hooked through each other's arms, in a long linear lineup of people, endlessly a long lineup. Well, the copper atom's doing something similar with its valence electrons. It's deficient of energy. It's been taken, it never had it. It was borrowing it from the sulfate ion, if it was copper sulfate or copper ore. The sulfate was lending its excess energy to the copper. Now it's gone. And so the copper is deficient. So, of course, it's going to be vulnerable to our attack. And that's literally what we do when we attack it with 400 volts of voltage from the battery pack to get the Tesla motor electric car to turn and rotate and move the car. We're attacking the copper winding of the motor with a humongous slap in the face. Oh, worse than that, more like a Thor's hammer. Pang! Giving it a big knock. And so, of course, it's going to respond, but with a pattern. And nothing more than a pattern. And you know, when you have a link of people linked arm to arm, if you do something to one person, it's going to have an impact on all the people down the line. Let's say you start tickling the first person, you know, or you put their feet under hot coals. Well, that may not ripple down the line too far, but I bet tickling will. Because we're all vulnerable to want to laugh, because we go through the more suffering we've gone through, the more vulnerable we are to laughter. So you get some grown-ups who've gone through a lot of painful experiences and have them link arm to arm, and then start tickling the person at one end, you're bound to have everybody guffawing and rolling in the aisles, and they won't be standing up anymore, linked arm to arm. Anyway, enough of the analogy. So impedance has to do with interference, the interference of non-change, and it's either destructive or constructive. But all you get out of that are patterns of movement. It's not actual movement. That's why we call it waveforms, and that's why we study them, because they are patterns of movement. What it is, it's not movement, it's per se, it's patterns of change happening across a medium, such as a copper wire. It's like people in a stadium, they do the Mexican wave, they stand up and sit down in sequence. From a distance, it looks like a wave is moving across the opposite side of the stadium from left to right, let's say, changing directions, changing speed. Yet when it reaches our side, of the stadium, we know nobody's running around. There's nothing moving sideways. It's just people standing up and sitting down. And when they stand up, they raise their arms. And then when they sit down, they lower their arms in sequence with certain timing and certain speed to make sure the wave stays alive. But nothing's moving sideways at all. It's a change of state. So each person standing up is like a change of state for a copper atom. It becomes excited. And when they sit down, it's like the excitation level of the copper atom is diminishing. At least, well, not the atom itself, but the electrons out, not even all the electrons, but just the electrons in the valence shell of the copper atom are changing state. And how much energy is that, right? So when we say E, this is a little off topic, but how much does E equals mc squared have anything to do with electricity? Very little, because you're dealing with valence electrons, and they are as far removed from the nucleus of the atom as can possibly be, and that's where most of the mass is. So when you say E equals mass times the speed of light squared, that has more to do with nuclear power than it does with electrical power. Very little of it has anything to do with electrical power. That's why electricity is so easy to manipulate, because for the most part, it's mostly information. And we know how easy it is to have a virus infect a computer and destroy the computer. And yet, the virus has no physical existence of its own. It's just a manifestation of a certain type of intelligence that seems to have a life of its own, to replicate itself, to perform certain functions of destruction and replication, and it infects a computer, and before you know it, the computer's infected and passing the virus to another computer, if they're open and vulnerable to each other. Well, electricity is a little different than a virus. It infects the circuit, and it alters the circuit because of that infection. It's like an infectious disease, but you can control it. Like any infectious disease, you can control it. And we control it usually with force. But you don't have to use force so with such vigor in order to get results. And if you give it a little slack, it'll amaze you with so-called free energy, which is really free work. A circuit will perform more work on less energy. And you're busy supposedly losing energy due to entropy. You're just losing it to destructive interference. That's all you're losing. The pattern that we called current, which makes up watts, is giving us a pattern of so-called energy now over time, watts over time, that is simply a pattern. That's all it is, a pattern of change, which is either constructive to a certain extent or it's destructive to a certain extent, but we always have some of both. That's why we always have negative impedance along with positive impedance at all times, to one degree or another, because there's simply types of interference. And when you have waves sloshing around, let's say in a bathtub, at some moment in time and at some point along the surface of the water, you're going to get constructive interference in which the waves add and become bigger. And in other places at that same moment in time, you're going to get destructive interference in which the waves partly or completely cancel and you get no waves. And that condition keeps changing over time as the waves keep sloshing around and bouncing off the sides, the walls of the bathtub. So there's always some constructive interference, there's always some destructive interference, which means that the circuit is always generating some energy at all times. There's always some so-called free energy, we should now call free work, going on in that circuit at all times, along with entropy, because there's always some of each. But it's a question of how well do you orchestrate the circuit to be mostly constructive and very little destructive, so that you get so much work out of that circuit that it becomes a self-runner, and then everybody says, oh my God, now we got a perpetual motion machine, blah, 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 that can't be right, it defies physics. Hogwash. Because we're not dealing with a pile of wood when we talk about energy. This has so little to do with thermodynamics, it's pitiful. It has everything to do with nonlinear dynamics. That's the essential nature of electricity. A wild stallion that wants to explode in your face without warning. That's the nature of electricity. But we put a bit and bridle in that horsey's mouth and we turn it into thermodynamics, as if we were burning the coil of copper winding in the motor of our Tesla car. No, we're not. We're not burning anything. Well, we had to burn some coal to boil water, to run the steam turbine, to rotate the rotary electric generator, to fire up the grid and recharge the batteries of your electric car. That is so hogwash, it's unbelievable. Not that people don't do that, but to tie thermodynamics to electricity, we might as well go back to burning coal in our fireplace and forget electricity, because we haven't really changed anything. We've just put a suit of clothes over it, which is called denial. We've put a suit of clothes called denial over the burning of coal and called it the generation of electrical power. That's all we've done. We've literally, I mean, if anybody's the emperor without clothes who doesn't know he doesn't have any clothes, we're it. Not that having no clothes on is anything wrong, but to be in denial about it, that's the part that got, what was that gal's name? I forget the gal. Back in the 1980s, she went to court for something. She had a TV program, and what got her convicted was that she lied in court. Not that she did dastardly things. And she went on with her TV programs afterwards. But she was found guilty for lying and had to serve time in prison because she lied in court about what she was doing. Well, we're lying to ourselves. It's calling it electrical power when it's really just coal. We're still tying ourselves to thermodynamics. And it's so unnecessary. Now that we have electricity at our disposal, we can dispense with thermodynamics for the most part. Never completely, but for the most part, to such a degree that we don't even need to hold ourselves responsible for supplying the thermodynamic prime mover that gets the electricity to move. The environment that we live in has plenty of thermodynamic activity, more than we could possibly ever require to tickle a circuit of a proper construction to produce all of the electrical power we could possibly ever desire, because it's just a bunch of patterns anyway. That's all electricity is. If you know anything about music, or looking at a voice recording that I'm making and looking at the voice waves, it's just patterns. That's all I'm recording onto my cell phone at the moment are patterns. And the energy, it's true, the energy of the cell phone is being utilized to mark those patterns, but they're all digital patterns. They're not even analog. I'm speaking, it's analog, yeah, analog waves. But the cell phone is recording ones and zeros, which is more viral than it is energy, even though you've got to have the energy of the cell phone to host that information. That's true. But you see how much we're dealing with information? We don't even know it, even with so-called free energy, which is really free work. It's free work because it's information. And we got to have energy to work the circuit so that we can get some work out of it. But when we fashion it in an intelligent fashion, we get more work with less energy, is what it amounts to. It's not that more energy comes out than what we put in. It's more work comes out than the energy that's flowing through it. That's what free energy amounts to. It's really, you're standing on the overpass over the freeway, and you're on one side watching the trucks and the cars come towards you and go underneath, and then you run to the other side of the overpass bridge to see them come out the other side, and they don't come out. Instead of trucks and cars, they're replaced by ducks and geese and rabbits. And so what the shit is going on? Where did all the trucks and the cars disappear to? Well, When Eric Dollard says that the energy that enters a capacitor is not the same energy that exits a capacitor, he was darn tootin' right. And that example I just gave you of the trucks going in and the ducks and the geese coming out is exactly how it works. If you put a label on every single electron, a name, and oh, you're Fred, you're George, you're Mary, you're Sue, and you watch them go into the capacitor, they won't exit. You'll get Harvey and you'll get Al and you'll get Sarah. You'll get completely different people that weren't even there to begin with who entered the capacitor. Completely different electrons. So it kind of tells you something about what is energy. If it's not a cord of firewood that you carry into your house to burn and go up the smokestack and release its energy, and then you got to go outside and chop some more cherry wood trees and not tell any lies about it. I mean, it's unbelievable how much in denial we are over this topic. So it gets me all riled up, and I think I've said enough. I'd be repeating myself at this point if I said anything more. But I just felt it was the only way to get it out rather than try to write it down, because what we believe doesn't make any sense when I think it through. And so I have to do it ad lib in a voice recording because that's the only way to do it, because it's such a hodgepodge of beliefs that we have slapped together, barely holding the house of cards together. And at some point it's going to fall. It may fall after everybody wakes up from some other shocking revelation. And it'll just be one additional event in a sequence of shocking revelations about how we've been lied to, or how we lie to ourselves to keep up the lie that we've been lied to. Any way you shake it, we're just as responsible as whoever started the lie in the first place, because we keep it going. And through peer pressure, we annoy people like me and tell people like me to go back to school and get an education because I don't know what I'm talking about. Well, that's the way you feel, then I suppose I've wasted my time. But Maharishi had a saying for that to Charlie when Charlie said, oh, gee, we wasted another day lecturing people on the benefits of TM and not a single soul took interest. He said, no, not a waste. Somewhere, sometime, a seed has been planted. Somewhere, sometime, seed will sprout. So he was saying, well, in some future life, it'll be that much easier for those people to comprehend how beneficial it is to incorporate meditation into your daily affairs. Not all day long, just, some of the day devoted to meditation. It's a pretty cool thing. Well, if I'm not reaching anybody, it's not entirely false. It's not entirely true. Because I am reaching all of you, it's just to what degree? Again, what kind of interference? Because I can't control what impact I have on you when I speak my words. I can't predict, I can't control. So, because you've been trained by other people, and so you may not be ready for what I have to say. And so it's going to have very little impact, but it's going to have some. It's going to loosen you up a little bit and make it easier for the next person to come down the line. And maybe you won't notice any progress in one lifespan, but whoever inherits your soul and all the memories of your experiences will have a little easier time of it than you did. And sequentially down the line, each incarnation will have an easier time than you did, because it'll wear down your ignorance to the point that you won't be ignorant anymore. Ignorance is a kind of inertia. It's got a momentum all its own. And fighting it's a waste of time because it just fights back. It wants to maintain itself. So you don't. You just plant your seed and let the waters of the person's consciousness intercede on your behalf to water those seeds, because they will. They will bear fruit, and then the person will take credit and forget that you ever said anything. Who are you? You're nobody. You never existed. And the person will take full credit for whatever has sprouted forth. It's just the way things are, The teacher, that's why teachers never get wealthy, because they never get the credit for doing anything useful. And yet they have all the credit in the world. they take on the karma of the student, the stupidity of the student. They take on that karma. It's a burden. It's a transfer of consciousness between teacher and student. And so it's a transfer of karma, a sharing of karma. But you won't see the teacher getting wealthy off of what they do. And yet they're all the reason how things progress forward. Anyway, I think I've said enough.